Hello everybody! As promised in this video, we're going to have an introduction to if statements. So along with for loops and while loops, if statements are one of the most important and fundamental aspects of computer programming. So we've seen for loops already. I know I said while loops, don't worry, those are coming soon. But today we're going to focus on if statements. So we're going to start by creating a function. And what we're going to do in this function is we're going to model the we're not going to model, we're going to write a function that gives us the absolute value of a number. So because the absolute value function, think about it, it's piecewise, right? So if x is greater than or equal to 0, we don't want to do anything. And if x is negative, we want to multiply it by a negative so it becomes positive. So for that reason, it makes sense to use an if statement here. Because basically, we want to be given a number, and we want to check, is this number 0 or greater than 0 already, or is it negative and do we need to do something to it? So that makes it a very natural candidate for using if statements. So again, I have a fresh function open. Let's give it a name. We shouldn't call it abs, like ABS, because that's already a built-in function. So let's call it just, how about my function, my underscore function. As an input, let's call it x just for some real number x. And let's call the output y. So the basic syntax for if statements is we're going to type the word if, followed by a condition that is going to be true, like a true or false condition basically. So we're going to say if x is less than 0, then I'm going to hit return. Then remember, we're returning y. So if x is negative, if I apply absolute value to x, that returns positive. So I should multiply by -1 and get negative x. And the same as with our for loops, our if statements, we need to end them with the word end. And I've put a semicolon here. And you might be wondering, do I need to put a semicolon after this if statement? It's unneeded. And in fact, if you put one, MATLAB is going to give a warning that says extra semicolon is unnecessary in if statement before a new line. So all that's saying is we don't need that. So I'm going to save it. Oops. There it goes. And now let's try running it. So I'm going to do my function, and let's try -7. And we can see that returns 7. So again, think of this function as, remember, we wrote it to be the absolute value, so that looks good. Let's try my function of 4. And it doesn't return anything in that case, so we'll get to that and kind of why we need that. Similarly, if we do my function of 0, doesn't return anything. So what's going on here? Let's go back to our function. And notice we only specified what happens in the case if x is less than 0. So if we return a negative number, it's going to give us the absolute value just fine. But what if that number is equal to 0 or greater than 0? So one thing that we can do is after the if, we can say else. And we don't need any statement after the else. So what this is saying is, first we check, is x less than 0? If that statement is true, then we say y is equal to -x. Otherwise, so if x is not less than 0, then what do we want it to do? And in this case, so if it's not less than 0, either x is equal to 0 or greater than 0, and in which case the absolute value is just x itself. So again, I'm going to say y equal to x in this case, and we don't need a semicolon after the else. Notice if I put one here, I'm going to get that warning from MATLAB that the extra semicolon is unnecessary. So let's save the function and try running it again. So notice now, let's try running my function of 4. That returns 4. My function of 0 returns 0. This is looking good. So kind of comment here is that it's always a good idea when you're writing functions to do boundary / like edge case checking. So for instance, in this case, 0 is kind of on that border of what we're checking because we're looking at negative and positive numbers. Maybe you forgot to consider 0. It works just fine in this case, but it's just a good practice to always test your functions on kind of the values where it might break. So let me show you a couple other things. So in this case, we were able to get it to work just fine with if-else, but I'm sure you could imagine a situation where you have maybe if one thing, and if that's false, then you want to check another thing, and maybe another thing. And the way we do that is with the keyword else if. So for instance, first we say, is x less than 0? If that's not true, then we go to else if. Now let's say, what if x is greater than 0? And what we want to do in that case, if x is positive, then we don't need to do anything for the absolute value, so we just say y equal to x. And notice in this case, I have excluded the value of 0. So I could do else here and have it return y equal to x, or something that you could do. So sometimes this is good for if you're trying to check your code for mistakes or error analysis. You could say maybe something like neither executed. And what this means is that x was not less than 0 and it was not greater than 0. So let's see how this works. Again, we can try my function of a negative number works just fine. If we try it with 4, that works fine. But when we have 0 now, we see it gets to neither executed, because remember, back in my function up here, I didn't include, well, what happens if x is exactly equal to 0? So you can have as many of these if or else if statements as you want. So you could have else if, else if, else if, and that's totally fine. And maybe one more thing we could do just to show you. So again, else if x, how do we check that x is equal to 0? We do x double equals 0. We also want y equal to x. So now we go back. We can do my function of 0 and it returns 0. -7 returns 7. 4 returns 4. Hi everyone, editing me here. There was some technical difficulties with the video file after this point. Luckily there was not really any extra material, just a moment for me to say thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. As always, let us know if you have any questions.